Okay. Thank you, everybody, for attending, joining us in January for our resource group. We're super excited for our contributor spotlight today. Erik Fowler is going to join us from White Labs. Before we get started, I always do a little housekeeping and mission statement stuff. So let's embark on that for the moment. As always, please put your information in the chat if you're a contributor with your email address and or where people can find you. And if you're attending, and you'd like to share where you are in your brewing process or where you are in the industry, you're welcome to share that in the chat as well. As we go through our event today, you're welcome at any time to raise your hand. That's in the little reactions at the bottom of your screen. And we'll keep an eye out for hand raising. Erik has said he's happy to field questions as he goes. So no problem with that. You can also put questions in the chat, and Candace will help me keep an eye on that, make sure we don't miss anything. And you're also welcome to chat back and forth privately through the chat with specific people that you might have questions for. Upcoming events, we have several things happening. You may be aware that we just launched our podcast. We're super excited about that. So episode 001 has already been released. It was released on the 3rd. And before we meet again for resource group, we have 3 others that we'll be releasing. We have 002 releasing January 17th. That's going to be Your Dream, the Gut Check. We have 003 releasing on January 31st. That's going to be called Your Dream Foundation Essentials. And then 004 releases on February 14th, right before we get into our next month's programming. That's going to be getting into the business plan, and we're going to talk about the academic perspective, and that's on Valentine's Day. We do have our first quarter webinar happening, our educational webinar, and that's done in conjunction with craft beer professionals. So thank you for that, Andrew. We're going to be doing that together on February 15th, and our contributor presenting for that is John Hyman, and he's going to talk about crafting your craft brewery employee handbook. So that's going to be super interesting. Our next resource group is February 22nd. That's Tom Hennessy from Colorado Boy. He's got a colorful, storied, very interesting background in terms of opening his breweries and opening others in conjunction with other people as well. I neglected to say that our podcast is in partnership with All About Beer. And we appreciate John Hall's technical expertise in fixing our flubs every once in a while as those happen. So lots of stuff coming up. Our mission statement, I always like to kind of bring us back to start here. Start a Brewery was developed to create a community within the craft beer industry to raise the bar for startups through education, while simultaneously lowering the barrier for those looking to live their dream. So that's kind of the short version of where we are and why we are. Sponsorship wise, we give plenty of thanks today to Arrived for sponsoring our January resource group. And unfortunately, nobody from Arrived was available today. So I just want to give them a quick plug here. A little bit of marketing spiel. Arrived is the most trusted point of sale system for your favorite food, drink, music, and hospitality spots. Our flexible all-in-one system reduces service friction for staff and guests alike with smart technology designed by industry experts and enthusiasts. With transparent pricing, a full suite of customizable features, and award-winning customer support, Arrived helps grow your business and create contagious loyalty for your brand. My personal experience with Arrived was through the craft beer and brewing new brewery accelerator workshops as a sponsor, and Nancy came and participated with us. But most of my Arrived in practice experience was when the pandemic hit and they developed their contactless ordering, which I think was timely and important. All right, so let's get going. We're going to start out with our spotlight. Erik is the Education and Brewery Experience Manager for White Labs. I think that kind of sells you short a little bit because you do so much more than just that, but I think just that has a lot under the umbrella too. So
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, no worries at all. So delighted. So let's start with an intro, a little bit about yourself. What do you like to do when you're not working? Just, who is Erik Fowler?
Who am I? I'm pretty much defined by my two kids at this point.
Okay.
Not that I don't love them, but hopefully at some point I can be defined more than by my career and kids. But hobbies will slowly come back, and when your hobbies are based around beer, those lines get blurred pretty easily when you end up homebrewing on weekends and still finding yourself at breweries on your time off.
True. Very true. So tell us about work. What do you specifically do with or for clients? What problems do you solve with the people you work with?
Yeah, so White Labs was founded in 1995. We're primarily a liquid yeast provider in North America, but we do have a global footprint. I'm based here in San Diego, which I would love to say is sunny and warm, but we've had a lot of flooding and rain the last week and a half. Definitely not as bad as the temperatures in Colorado and Virginia and where everybody on this call are from, but we like to think that we're a one-stop shop for all fermentation needs. So, while our bread and butter is brewer's yeast, primarily 001 California ale yeast, we have a TTB certified analytical lab where we offer services in our chemistry lab to validate a lot of different aspects of people's products, whether it's finished or in process. We offer nutrients, enzymes. A large part of my role, aside from education, is overseeing White Labs Brewing Co. We've got 2 brew pubs, one here and one in Asheville, North Carolina, where we are a commercial brewery as well, and tying in from R&D in a kitchen to using brewer's yeast and pizza dough and trying to get the general consumer excited about yeast and fermentation, to working with our legitimate R&D team on new yeast strains that break down select hop compounds to release new aromas. And there's always a lot going on, and there's a lot of audiences that we serve, and I couldn't be happier in my role being able to work with all of those audiences, whether it's a professional brewer or somebody just wanting to learn more about yeasts and be able to understand the products that they enjoy. That's kind of a mouthful, but I hope it was kind of made sense.
Yeah, it does. I think some of what I hear from the regular drinker is that it's cool to just show up and taste beers that are identical except for the yeast strain used.
Yeah, and that's primarily what we do is with the commercial brewery is, we tend to change one variable. We split batch everything, and that one variable happens to be yeast. So, we do a lot of mixed 4-packs when we do packaged beer, and it's not 2 different IPAs or an IPA and a stout or a lager. It's the same IPA with 2 different yeast strains to allow that side-by-side comparison, because it really does make a big impact, which we'll get into more detail on.
Sounds good. How did you first get involved in craft beer? Tell us your story.
Yeah, I've been in beer for over 10 years now. I actually started in wine. I was a fan of beer, but I was working at Trader Joe's and had the opportunity to take over the wine department. And I'd been there about 6 months, and they were fairly skeptical, not because of my knowledge and passion, just because it's managing that department's a lot. I don't know what their numbers look like now, but we were doing $20,000 a day in wine sales. And if you've seen a footprint of a Trader Joe's, it's pretty small. I can imagine it's higher now with inflation. So that was probably 2011, 2010 now. And I was able to take that job and work on the side at another small mom and pop wine retailer seasonally for a couple of years. And it really taught me a lot about connecting with a beverage. And the whole time I was interested in beer, studying beer, becoming a certified Cicerone, I believe in 2012, 2013. And that was in Virginia, in the DC area. And I moved back to California when my wife was done with grad school, and was able to get a job at a small nano brewery. I was fortunate to take that job because I did everything. I was the only paid employee. And if they needed me to brew, if they needed me to work and manage the bar, if they needed me on boots on the ground trying to sling kegs, I did it all, and not well. I learned a lot, and it wasn't my dollar. And that's something that I try to teach people a lot, is you're going to make mistakes when you're growing and learning. And if you're going to make those mistakes, not to sound crass, but try to do it on somebody else's dollar. Don't learn the first time with, you've never worked in a brewery and you've homebrewed for a long time and you want to start a business and open a brewery, that's great. But, shadow somebody else, learn what mistakes they've made. And like I said, I was fortunate with that brewery, and they're since now defunct, and learning what worked and what didn't. And I was learning with the owners at the time. And that was some of the problem, right? When I first got my Cicerone certification, I said about 10 years ago, moved back to San Diego, I was applying to a lot of breweries, and most didn't even know what it was. I took a lot of pride in it. Studied for about a year, upfronted a lot of money, or what to me at the time on a college budget was a lot of money, $500-600 to take the exam, and ended up barely passing. But I was really proud of it, and I put it on my resume and tried to get a lot of jobs and interviews around San Diego, and nobody really knew what it was. And I think that's changed a lot in the last 10 years, which is great, just to see those certifications and educational resources stand for a lot more than they once did, whether it's the certificate of the business of craft beer from San Diego State, or some of the other programs at local universities. There's a lot of opportunities there now for education before having to start a brewery, right? There's a lot of learning resources that are available that weren't there, I think 10 years ago.
Yeah, for sure. I think, our educational resources page is some kind of attempt to say, you should go do this. Like you should go do as much of this as you can before you get into something of your own.
Yeah. And when we talk about yeast management in a little bit, we can get into more examples, but it's crazy to me, how many I see on online forums all the time. I see on craft beer professionals quite a bit, where somebody will ask, like, well, I've been homebrewing, I want to brew, I've got $1,500, what's the best resource I could put that money to? And a lot of people chime in with brewing schools, online brewing courses. And I from my experience, some of the best advice is marketing, sales, and business admin courses. Put the money to the things you're not familiar with. Brewing's great, but that, as most people on this call probably know or will know someday, like, beer technically pays the bills, but understanding business, I think, is very important.
Mm-hmm. It's often a passion project, and business isn't always the passion. It's the brewing, it's the beer.
Right.
Sure. So did White Labs understand what a Cicerone was, what a certified Cicerone was, and snatch you up? Is that the path that got you where you are right now?
So I worked at that Nana Brewery for about 2 years, and then I helped open a tap room for Stone Brewing Company. Stone at the time was really difficult to get a job with as well. I probably applied there 6 to 9 times before I got a call back. And I was able to be hired under a manager role, help open that tap room. It was very service focused. We had a kitchen. We were next to the Major League Baseball stadium. And it was great. I learned a ton with that job, but not many people came in really asking about beer. Everybody was coming in asking for that Bastard Ale, or not even knowing Stone brewed Eric Bastard. A lot of conferences and tourists from out of town, which was great. I mean, beer shouldn't be pretentious, and you shouldn't need an explanation every time you order a beer. I think that's turned a lot of people off over the years, but that's not what I wanted. I wanted to be challenged. I wanted people to ask me questions that I didn't know the answer to. And I've been with White Labs for 8 years now, and every day somebody asks me a question that I don't know the answer. And maybe the industry doesn't, but hopefully somebody sitting next to me at another desk, or somebody that's been around a long time, does have the answer. That's so awesome. I've been here, going on 9 years this year, and have focused on education since. And we've grown that department quite a bit in that time.
You've seen
along with White Labs Brewing Co. Yep.
Yeah, you've seen a ton of expansion over that period of time with White Labs, yes?
Yeah, it's the industry in general, which this year is an interesting one when it comes to expansion or lack thereof.
Mm-hmm. True. We just recorded one of our podcasts, and we're talking about that. So getting into your experience with White Labs or the industry as a whole, what's the coolest project you've ever worked on related to the industry, and what was your role in it?
So that's a tough question. Coolest, most impactful. I would say coolest is pretty recent, just because it kind of stands out to me. So I'm on the board of directors for the San Diego Brewers Guild, and with that has come a lot of fun what I would consider passion projects. And when I joined that board, one of my goals was to start the conversation again on putting San Diego on the map of being a premier beer city. Because I think for 15 years, San Diego is known as the greatest beer city in the US. And if you disagree, you probably at least would recognize that it's in the top couple, or was. But beer's gotten better everywhere. People have realized it's a very lucrative industry. And, coming back from Asheville, North Carolina once a month, you land in their airport, says Beer City, USA, right? They know what they're doing and have amazing beer. Between Colorado, some of the cities in Colorado, specifically Denver and San Diego, like you couldn't really argue between those, aside from those two, up until 5+ years ago. So we are trying to challenge our members and challenge ourselves, and what would help differentiate San Diego as a beer city, because it's not an IPA anymore. Everybody's making great IPAs, and does anybody even make West Coast IPAs anymore? Anybody on this call? They still sell, but it's not what it once was. And so last year, Tom Kiley, previously of Thorn Brewing, was on the board with me, and he really wanted to brew as local of a beer as possible. And so we kind of came up with the idea of a San Diego state beer, and it's been done before. There's terroir driven beers, and it's not the first time it's been done, but we've really tried to challenge ourselves and our members, like, what would that mean on a commercial scale for multiple breweries, though? Not a rogue one and done beer, or Sierra Nevada one and done beer, but what would that look like as a San Diego beer? Is that a seasonal fruit? Is that a specific yeast strain? A lot can grow in Southern California, but it's very expensive here. And so farms are very selective on what they produce. And it takes a long time to start growing new crops and have something to the quantity that a lot of commercial breweries could use. So we started the Estate Beer Project, and to start defining what San Diego beer was, is we reached out to homebrewers first. We thought they were the most innovative, probably the most receptive, and we worked with Quaff, which is a big homebrewing club based in San Diego. And we said, whoever submits a beer, whoever wins the most San Diego beer, can be brewed as a pro-am, as a collaboration with a commercial brewery. And we ended up judging not just based on quality, but based on story and potential. And we had some beers that came in that were great beers, but didn't really showcase any local ingredients. And by local, I mean, could be California, could be West Coast, could be somebody's backyard. We were trying to help define what local is. And one of the beers that ended up winning, that White Lab selected, was a wit beer, which, go figure, is a pretty adaptable style. And we used California grown malt from Admiral, which is up in Alameda. And we used, our yeast strain, which is propagated here in San Diego. Everybody's using localish water, right? And then we used botanicals that were grown in Southern California as well. And it was a cool project and a cool story. And it's, hit a bit of a wall, because how do you move on from there, right? You get people excited about it, but unless the ingredients are readily available and not cost prohibitive, it's a cool one and done beer, but we're still trying to work on how to sustain that long term. But we've created a lot of partnerships with different farmers locally, who have a lot of ideas, and some local nonprofits that are providing different ingredients that we could possibly use, or at least create more accessibility for San Diego brewers.
That's super cool. That sounds pretty complex. My next question is, what's the most complex or problematic project you've worked on in the industry? Does that get back to yeast, or are you really more on the bigger picture of where are we?
No, well, that's probably should be the answer. It's where are we and where's the industry going? But no, I was thinking about what's the most problematic or complex project I've worked on, and just making it very personal based off my experiences. Managing sensory panels has been one of the most difficult things to keep up with, and I think it's something that's very impactful for any size brewery and very affordable. But it's very difficult to maintain unless you put a lot of priority and emphasis on it. So I've managed our sensory panel here off and on for about 5 years, and have delegated it to others within that time. But the most difficult part is just managing people, and sensory panel or not, probably comes back to people. But you would think that getting people to taste beer midday is easy, but it's not. And getting people to sit down consistently and go through a flight, and no matter how easy you make it, it's very difficult to do consistently. And that's probably been one of the most difficult things that I've personally managed as a project, and not just managing staff. You mentioned HR and handbooks. I mean, that's probably the most difficult, but that's not really related to yeast and fermentation. So
I think the universal challenge is communication and people management. Yes, I would absolutely echo that. And sensory is so freaking important. I'm in the Cleveland area a lot now, and it's interesting the comparison between Colorado and the awareness of QA/QC and the awareness of sensory compared to the awareness here is pretty dramatic. I mean, everybody has their curve of growth and awareness, and I'm sure that this area will, have the same awareness plateau, like of goodness and awesomeness, and the bigger breweries are definitely supporting that. But it's interesting to see that awareness and the establishment of those tasting panels, and little breweries getting to understand what a sensory panel is and why it would be useful.
Yeah, definitely. The maturation of an industry, of an area, definitely takes time. But going back to that first brewery that had since failed, there was a memory that I have that I'll never forget. Is we had a Baltic porter that we lagered for about 3 months, and it was the one beer all these accounts wanted, and I was so excited to finally bring it to them, and I pre-sold a lot of it. It was the day to bring it around. I wasn't the one to keg it, and I go and I deliver it to our top 10 accounts, and our owner, head brewer, calls me the next day and says, "Hey, I just tasted this beer and it's contaminated. You need to go pick all those kegs up." And I had to drive around in my little sedan, and half of them didn't tap it yet, so they were kind of okay with it. And there was one premium beer bar in San Diego that had poured through half of it, and they were pissed. They said, I buy based off of styles, and that fit that handle. I need something else to fill that handle. I'm like, we make 4 different beers, like we don't have anything. And I can't remember if they ever reordered from us, but having some sort of sensory, maybe not a defined sensory panel, but some check where somebody needs to check a box and put their initials next to it, even if it's a brewery of 4 people, would have saved a lot of that headache, and probably helped us grow, to be honest. And 10 accounts doesn't seem like much, but when you only have 10 accounts, it's a lot.
Right. Even defining what your beers should taste like, I think it's helpful to have that standard. All right, we'll stop that rabbit hole. All right, so you wanted to talk today about proper yeast handling and how that affects your cost of goods. So let's go down that rabbit hole. Educate us.
Yeah, so as we were talking about when we were kind of going back and forth on setting up this group and the spotlight, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak to everybody that's on the call now or that listens in the future. It's when we're not dealing with all strictly brewers, how do you talk about the importance of yeast and fermentation? You could taste it. Well, we're all remote, so we can't do that. But I think it's important to understand how all roles could potentially be impacted by yeast handling and purchasing, and just understanding raw materials in general. We give professional workshops about 6 times a year where we'll have brewers or QA/QC staff fly in from all over the US and sometimes internationally to take these technical fermentation workshops. And one of the biggest challenges that, we've started being better at incorporating is they'll end the course and say, I realize we're not doing A, B, and C the best we could. I understand that now. How am I going to go back and tell my boss that? Right. And I think there's a much broader approach to yeast handling that can be applicable to all. So I have some, these 5 tips and tricks that might apply to technical brewing, and others that might just be a little more broad. But the first that I would really hit on is understanding forecasting. So that's important on so many levels, but know what you're going to brew before you brew it. Don't just determine because something's getting low, you're going to rebrew it. I mean, that's probably the nature of the beast in a lot of small pub breweries. But if you're buying a pitch of yeast and it's $500 and you're going to only use it once because you're not going to rebrew a batch of beer that you could harvest, store in the correct amount of time and repitch that, then, the cost of goods for the yeast of that batch is $500. But when you ferment beer, you generally get about 3 to 5 times the biomass. The physical yeast replicates, right? It buds and creates more yeast. So you end up with more yeast post-fermentation than you pitched. And if you buy enough yeast for one batch, you end up with more yeast at the end that, if handled properly, you can actually collect that, be as sanitary as possible, and repitch that into 2 fermenters. So all of a sudden you took that $500, let's use $600 because math's a little bit easier. And then all of a sudden had 3 fermenters that you inoculated with. You cut that down from $600 to $200 a batch, and so on and so forth. And that can be used oftentimes for months when handled properly. So really forecasting what your schedule is to know, I have this clean American ale strain that is great in IPAs. It's good in porters. I could do a blonde ale with it. There's a lot of different styles that I could do with this yeast strain. So how can I know that this yeast is probably going to be ready in about 10 days, 2 weeks, to put on my schedule another batch of beer that will use that same yeast strain and cut that expense in half.
Gotcha. How long or how many ways could you, if you were doing it well, wisely, could you split that?
Some breweries will do it indefinitely. I probably wouldn't recommend that. There are ways to quantify yeast health and how much is living and how much you need to pitch. Oftentimes, breweries that are using it for years and years probably don't have the best yeast handling. There are exceptions to everything, but generally you would probably look at, let's say, 5 generations, 10 generations, and there could be split fermenters and fermentations on that. So you could be working at 20 different fermenters that you're using from the same lab grown pitch of yeast.
Gotcha. So you're bringing that cost of goods way, way, way down into the like $20.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. And it's key to not store it for a long time between batches. You're looking at 1 to 3 days is optimal, possibly up to a week when handled correctly. So that's why forecasting and scheduling is very important, because you don't have a long time to sit on that to decide what you're brewing next. You need to know ahead of time. And I often wish breweries would ask those types of questions when they're initially buying that first pitch, because we would be able to help set them up for success right at the beginning, as opposed to, I've been sitting on this yeast for 2 weeks and I used it and it didn't perform very well.
Gotcha. Okay, what's number 2?
Number 2, I would say treat your yeast like beer. So when I talk about storage, short period of time, but essentially, brewer's yeast is very sturdy in the world of microorganisms. It can endure a lot. It can endure a lot of stresses, such as alcohol, low nutrients, anaerobic conditions, but you just generally want to treat it as if you treat a finished beer. You want to keep it cold. You don't want to agitate it too much. You want to keep it free from oxygen, right? Oxygen's gonna ruin finished beer. It's going to oxidize, even the very smallest amounts, whereas finished yeast will begin to deplete its storage resources and its storage carbohydrates if oxygen's present. So just a general rule, if you're not going to do it to your beer, don't do it to your yeast.
Okay, cool. What's number 3?
Number 3, I would say define your finished beer's profile, as you kind of mentioned, and work backwards. So know what you want the beer to taste like before you brew it. And there's, new ingredients or new processes that you might change, but have an idea of what you want that beer to be, because we've learned a lot having split batches and doing the same beer with different yeast strains side by side. You would often think that if you say, let's say we're working with an adjunct like coffee, if you want a beer to have more roast character from the coffee, you're probably going to change your coffee, right? Or maybe the way you infuse it, or the type of roast, a dark French roast or espresso roast compared to a lighter blonde roast. But I've often seen that sometimes changing your yeast strain or changing your fermentation temperature will help accentuate or diminish the characteristics of adjuncts. So if you have an idea of how, say, fruity you want something to be, maybe instead of picking an overly fruity coffee, you pick something a little more middle of the road and balanced, but pick a yeast strain that expresses a little bit more fruit characteristics, because they all interact and play a matrix. And I would just suggest, while doing so, to change, again, one variable at a time. Don't change the coffee and the yeast strain, because then you're not going to know what in fact made it fruity or less fruity.
Right. Interesting. There's a lot of different flavor components that go into deciding what your ingredients will be. Yes.
Yeah, definitely. And I can't say that, White Labs or any yeast provider would have the answer to say, I want to use this in this beer and get this result. But there are some rules of thumb that we could help suggest to achieve that desired result. But if you have something in your head, at least you'll know if you hit it or not. And when we're talking about sensory, maybe write down what that beer should taste like, and then see if it hits it or not. And if it doesn't, then at least you can look at that recipe and that finished beer and say, what do I need to change here to get here?
Right.
And it's with all ingredients, not just yeast, but yeast is pretty finicky and pretty easy to manipulate compared to, I should say it's pretty easy to manipulate to have a great impact on flavor compared to other ingredients.
Do different formats of yeast, dried, blah, blah, blah. Do you get different flavor variations based on the format of the same kind of yeast?
You shouldn't, no. There are differences in processing. Dry yeast goes through a different process to actually manufacture it, and tends to not be as expressive, but that shouldn't be as. Dry yeast is their manufacturing process is a lot better than it's ever been. So you can make very quality beer with dry yeast, just like liquid yeast. A big advantage of liquid yeast is going to be the variety. There's a lot more yeast strains available. So if you want that nuanced fruit character because you're brewing an English beer, you can have 20 strains to choose from for liquid yeast, whereas dry, you might have 3 if you're lucky.
Gotcha. Okay. What's next
10,
up on
10, 20 years ago, that would have been a different conversation, though.
Yes, I hear you.
The next one would be understanding conditions and how your yeast react to them. So, understanding that the temperature you ferment at, the quantity of yeast that you use, the nutrient profile of your wort is all going to affect the way that yeast performs, but more importantly, affect flavor. So, an example I like to use a lot is when Kvike yeast, which is a Norwegian farmhouse yeast, came onto the market a couple years ago. Home brewers for about a year and a half were really hitting home with this before professional brewers even started talking about it. And I think it's great for home brewing because it's very temperature tolerant. So you can ferment it at 90 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit and have a beer that tastes decent. And that's not true for most yeast strains. Most have to be around room or cellar temperature to produce something that we actually want to drink. And it was once it was the California Craft Brewers Conference specifically that I saw these questions change. And I don't know what it was about when we released ours and Omega released their Kvike strain 2, or one of their new ones. And everybody kept coming up asking about it all of a sudden. And their questions were, it's so they're saying you're saying it's true that I can actually make a beer in 3 to 5 days. And I said, yeah, it's true, but your question should be, does this make my beer better? Right? Does this give me a better beer? And then what does the time frame look like? It happens to make it in 3 to 5 days. That's great. And I don't think those strains ever really took off commercially. But I think in certain pubs, it makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of small brew pubs in tourist towns, say on the Eastern Seaboard, and they just get slammed for 4 months and have no capacity. And then they're dead for the rest of the year. Having a strain that you can produce a blonde ale in 3 days, like, yeah, you should probably use that. But what's unique about that is you need to understand the temperature range of those yeast strains and how it can impact your fermentation timeline. So understanding the conditions that you use your yeast in and understanding how it's going to create a finished beer, I think is really important, because you can manipulate that quite a bit to get your desired result.
So are you saying that if you use a yeast that's not as flavorful because you want that speed, then you might need to amp up flavor in other areas?
Yeah, that's a good way of looking at it. I tend to see they produce a little more flavor than you'd probably want a lot of times. Warmer temperatures generally mean more flavor. Those strains, though, are unique in that you can do these really high temperatures and not have it doesn't necessarily correlate to the amount of flavor, right? You double the temperature, it's not going to be double the flavor, right? With those yeast strains, which is unique. But they do have some unique characteristics of their own. I think it's just a good example because it's an extreme outlier. It's not very common to be able to. In distilling, you see those temperature ranges a lot because distilling doesn't give a shit about flavor as a whole. Right. There's a lot of craft distillers and a lot of distillers, of course, care about flavor. But from fermentation, they want it hot and fast. They want ethanol. They don't care what it tastes like. They generally don't care if there's a lot of leftover sugars. They're going to just distill the booze out and manipulate it through maturation, through adding different herbs and spices or in a barrel. But quality in, quality out. So I think some of the best distillers actually come from big brewers because they really take their time with their fermentation. And some of the largest global distilleries, you'd be surprised on how little they care about fermentation, how little they understand it.
Interesting.
Yep.
Okay.
Last but not least, I just say tell your story, right? Going back to that estate beer or working with a specific yeast strain. If you're doing something cool, brag about it. I'm very biased. Hops get all the love. Everybody's got cryo XYZ on their can now. But if you're working with a cool yeast strain or something proprietary, let it be known and let people understand that the ingredients and processes you're doing are affecting flavor and creating the beers that they love.
I think people are starting to learn a little bit more about malts. I think there's been a big push guild-wise. Is there, other than White Labs and other yeast companies, is there a push or a focus or a guild of some kind that's helping to educate people about what yeast is about?
No, there's not. And yeast manufacturers are rather standoffish as a whole compared to other raw materials. It's interesting. Hops tend to have, especially malt, though. I think malt just has there's so many artisan maltsters now that they have no craft yeasters guild, no, that they have to band together to find some market space. And yeast has been dominated by very few companies for 25 plus years now, and it's changing. There are a lot of other opportunities, and there's a lot of other smaller yeast labs that are coming to market. But what makes it so difficult is it's fairly expensive to make, and it's has awful shelf stability. So when you're working with malt and hops, you can generally sit on them for a while comparatively to yeast. So yeast, there's just a lot of logistics involved, which I think the barrier to entry is a little bit difficult. But there are a lot of smaller labs that have popped up in the last 10 years, which is great.
Yeah, I think I started in distribution world first, and that was the thing about beer, was the shelf life was so short. So the spirits, it wasn't a big deal, and the non-alc wasn't a big deal, and wine wasn't a big deal, but beer, it was the shelf life. It was that kind of stability. Do you think, and I'm not really looking to do more than educate, but is there a vast difference in the different yeast providers in terms of availability for education or assistance, or just generally helping brewers to figure out what they need and how they can go about doing a good job with their yeast?
I think it just depends on your relationship and your size of brewery and your needs,
Okay.
right? Some of these yeast labs are small and only a couple people and are creating a lot of innovative, genetically modified strains. That's not something that we've delved in at this point. I personally don't think there's a huge market demand for that for a company of our size. But if you're a company of 3 or 4 people and you do have a small lab and you can make these unique strains, then there probably is a business there that you could support yourself with. Because we're a larger company and have been in the industry for a long time, we do have a lot of those resources, like mentioned in the way of those workshops that we provide, in the form of a fairly large customer service and sales team. And having a global impact as well in 3 manufacturing facilities really helps, because there's been times where one plant might go down for a week and it doesn't really affect inventory too much, because you can have the other 2 manufacturing sites pick up the slack there. And those are some of the same challenges that a brewery might have as well.
Gotcha. So tell us about your ideal client. Is it somebody who's streaming, somebody who's established and open? What's your perfect, like, who can you help the most? How do you define that?
Who could we help the most?
Ideal client was the question.
Yeah. An ideal client, I think it depends, and it depends on their needs and what aspect of whether it's analytical services or just buying a straight pitch. I'll rephrase it as the brewery that I love working with the most would be somebody that uses 3 to 5 yeast strains annually, maybe more with some one-offs, especially in like an R&D sense, or like a pub. But a decent sized brewery that's not afraid to use multiple yeast strains to help differentiate their brands and understands the impact of using multiple yeast strains for a core lineup. There's breweries that are 10,000 barrels up, and some that I love, some of the breweries that I probably purchased the most, that might use one yeast strain for everything, and you can tell. But then there are other breweries that use multiple yeast strains and, use one yeast strain in their brown ale and something else in their IPA, and obviously something else in a Heifer Belgian. That gives a little bit more diversity to their lineup. And those are the ones that I like working with a lot, because it just tends to be a little more fun,
Mm-hmm.
and
Are there
more
breweries,
challenging, but
yeah,
more
are
fun.
there breweries that only use one yeast strain all day?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. If they're doing lagers, there are some breweries that will use an ale strain for a cool fermented ale and call it a lager or Kolsch, and get around that. I don't tend to see that as much anymore, though. I think those are a lot of those 1990s era brew pubs. You would see more of that. And what we've seen is a lot of those are closing. You see all the rock bottoms and all that going out of business, which some of the best breweries brewers in the US have come from rock bottoms. So it's a big bummer losing that as a growth resource to kind of funnel everybody up into opening their own breweries.
I hadn't thought about it that way, but that makes sense. What would be our key flags, as contributors on Start a Brewery, when we're talking with someone that would indicate that you might be able to help them or that they need help?
Looking at making decisions and choices based off of yeast and fermentation being intimidating, right? An example that I have is there was a local brewery who since went out of business, which as I get, more experience and as I get in longer and longer in the industry, I start seeing this stuff cyclical and come full circle, which is interesting but not surprising. And they would come in, their brewer would come in to pick up yeast like every week, which is great because the more yeast we sell, the more presents that are under the tree for my kid at Christmas. And he kept coming and buying new yeast, and I just asked him, like, you just bought a pitch of this last week, like, why do you keep buying so much yeast? Like, do you harvest and repitch it all? And he's like, no, I don't do any of that. I don't have a microscope. And I said, buy a microscope and you can come in here on the day that you're just working the cellar or whatever, and I'll spend 2 hours with you teaching you how to cell count, like for free. Like, just come by and hang out. Like, we'll have a beer, we'll get out a microscope and a slide and look at some yeast under the microscope. And he said, no, my owner will not let me buy a microscope. And they're about $150, low end one. So all in all, you can invest probably $500, and he's coming in buying $200 worth of yeast every week. And I just thought it was so crazy. I don't know if it was much the owner or the brewer not wanting to admit to the owner that he's been doing it the wrong way for a long time and felt intimidated because maybe he didn't use a microscope since high school or college. And and I encounter a lot of people like that too. There's a lot of ego in it. And the best brewers that I deal with have no ego, and they always want to learn more, and they want you to tell them they screwed something up. And that's really what differentiates, I think, somebody that's successful and willing to grow and learn. I mean, you deal with somebody like Mitch Steele, and everybody respects Mitch, and he's the first one to ask questions about anything. And there's a reason that is who he is and is so renowned, because he's not arrogant and never acts like he's the be all end all, although he probably knows way more about beer than most.
Got it. Anybody have questions for Erik? Talking about yeast, talking about white labs, talking about hospitality. I always have more questions, but let's give everybody else an opportunity to ask some. You're welcome to just throw your hand up, unmute yourself. Andrew.
I'll jump in, Erik. Looking at craft beer now, what trends are you excited about for the year moving forward?
I'm excited about NA. Skeptical but excited. They're very difficult to do well. There's not many I've had that really jump out at me, and I worry a little bit that it's cannibalizing from our own beer drinkers as opposed to trying to pull in a younger demographic who's not really drinking beer right now. But I'm excited about it because it's different, and it's forcing breweries to look at new products. And if you look at the way NA beer is produced, it's very different than brewing a normal beer. And there's a lot of processes that brewers are very unfamiliar with, that they're just pieces of equipment and ways of handling it that are just very different. And the more breweries open up to that, I think the more innovation we'll see on the beer side.
I love it. I'm excited about that space too.
Yeah, that'll be interesting. I think you're right, though. I think people that are experimenting with NA are often beer drinkers to start with.
Yeah. We brought some athletic, and we've got athletics just down the street here, and we brought some of their beer into our tap room, and I don't expect us to sell that much of it, but it's a good alternative.
Mm-hmm.
I just wonder, I think we as an industry, I sound so negative on this hour, but you got to see where the last couple of months have been at. We shit on smoothie beers and all that as an industry for so long, and I just think it was the wrong approach, because it was bringing a demographic into a brewery that we normally wouldn't have. And I think that pretentiousness was really cool when I got into craft beer, right? Like, I wanted to go to the tap room that was a hole in the wall, and they pour it right from the serving tank, and it's this little bar built from pallets. But that's not what the consumer wants anymore. They want a good experience, and they want flavors that they want. They don't want to drink, although I say that, and then you get breweries like Stone that are bringing back, or Firestone Walker that are bringing back some of their old flagships like Ruination and all that too. So there's some nostalgia involved, but I think as an industry, we really need to attract new drinkers. And and be okay with producing stuff that maybe we don't want to drink. Like, that's fine. Not everything's for us.
You might laugh, but the #1 most watched CDP video of this past year was on how to make a smoothie sour beer.
Yeah, I bet a lot of people were probably embarrassed to admit that they watched it too. They shouldn't be, but I think people held off.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mandy, what you got?
You could certainly say from a capacity standpoint, the industry is way overbuilt and our equipment could be used to make lots of things that are not beer.
Yeah,
And
that's a great point.
And certainly at our business, we decided a couple of years ago that, if all we're going to do is make and package beer, we're going to be in trouble. We need to that's our core, but we need to diversify around that. And in order to attract more drinkers, I like to tell people that when we started in business 30 years ago, people I was selling beer to looked a lot like me in every respect. And, now we have a new generation of consumer. It's a whole different age cohort, and the diversity of that cohort is way different than my cohort, and beer is not their thing. These things run in cycles. I think beer will always be a thing. There will always be beer. But the number of choices in drinks that have emerged in the last 10 or 15 years is mind-boggling.
I totally agree. And they're the best they've ever been too, right? Just like consumable goods are really good these days. Like, we're very spoiled, and just the recession, will be interested to see who puts their money where their mouth is when it comes to premium products. And I'm with you too. Like, there's no white bearded tattooed guys in the beer industry. So, I'm the only one, I guess.
You're the only one.
Yeah. Right.
Well, but it's great to see.
Yeah.
But older folks like me got to figure out what it is they want. It's not what I want.
Yeah.
And what I want is not important. That was what I wanted was important 30 years ago.
Yeah. I often ask at work, who gives a shit, and we'll have a meeting and everybody's talking about, this is the coolest thing we've ever had. I'm like, but who cares? Like, somebody does. We care, but we're not buying it.
Well, and I have a hard time seeing what the next hot thing in beer is going to be, but I think we need to expand our mind and see what is the next hot thing in drinks, in beverage, because we can make that too. We make kombucha, we can make coffee, we can make all these different things that appeal to the folks who are connected to our beer drinking customers, and we want them to enjoy what we have as well.
Totally agree.
Do you think that doing additional products like you guys do in your restaurants that use yeast will maybe help to bring that profile up and help people understand all the things that yeast does?
Yeah, I think so. Kombucha is obviously a big one because yeast and bacteria and fermentation are in so many things, right? You have a bagel, yogurt, cup of coffee in the morning, like all three of those are fermented to some capacity. But you also see a commercial from Bud or Miller or something years ago that said there was the 4 ingredients in beer were barley, rice, water, and hops, right? They excluded yeast, and everybody's up in arms. But a lot of people don't want to see yeast on their package, right? They don't understand what it is, how it might impact their body. It's a turnoff for a lot of people, a lot of consumers. So there's a lot of education that's involved in it, but those consumers aren't really buying, again, premium products, right? They're not spending $14 on a 4-pack of something, or $7 on a kombucha, or $7 on a coffee. But all of those artisan products do have a big impact from yeast and indoor fermentation, and help people understand that. Totally
makes sense. All right, we should wrap up to respect everybody's time. Erik, thank you so much for being here. Yeah, thank you for having me. It's great. Delightful talking at all of you for the last hour. I ask questions.
No, you guys are great.
I want to just reiterate that we have lots of things coming up. So if you haven't listened to our episode 001 of the podcast, pay attention. We've got episodes 2, 3, and 4 coming before we meet again as a resource group. We've got our quarterly educational webinar coming up on February 15th. We've got Tom Hennessy is our next resource group contributor spotlight victim contributor. I don't think you felt like a victim. And that's going to be super interesting for February. We really appreciate partnering with All About Beer for our podcast, with craft beer professionals for our educational webinars, and are really excited for all of our contributors to be part of these resource groups as well. So thank you again to Arrived, even though they couldn't be here in person today. We're super appreciating their support. Thank you again to Erik, and we'll wish you all a great evening, afternoon, depending on what time zone you're in, and look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thanks for having me. It was good
Thank
seeing
you, thank
everybody.
you.
I miss
Likewise.
all you guys.